The year was 329 BC. The sun burned down mercilessly on the dusty streets of a Bactrian city that had long since bowed to the weight of Alexander's advancing armies. The heat pressed on every stone wall, every clay house, and every weary face in the crowd that gathered along the narrow road. The people whispered, some curious, some fearful, all drawn by the same irresistible force, the promise of a public reckoning. Through this street came a figure that few would have expected to see in such humiliation. His name was Bessus. Once he had been the satrap of Bactria, governor of vast lands on the eastern edge of the Persian Empire, a man who commanded soldiers, collected tribute, and held court in opulence. But what moved through the crowd now was not a governor. It was a prisoner, his hands lashed tightly behind his back, his face swollen and darkened with dried blood, his robe torn and filthy after days of relentless interrogation. The crowd leaned forward as he stumbled past, some spitting, others merely staring in silence. They knew what was to come. Word had spread quickly through the villages and valleys, Alexander the Great himself had pronounced the sentence. And not just any death, this was to be impalement alive, one of the most feared and degrading executions in the ancient world. But why had this man, once honored as a Persian noble, fallen so far? To the bystanders, some details were clear. They knew he had betrayed a king. They knew he had dared to raise his own hand against Darius III, the King of Kings. They knew Alexander's fury had been stoked not by victory in battle, but by the scent of treachery. Yet the full story, how Bessus moved from the halls of power to the stake awaiting him, was far darker and more tangled than any single whisper could tell. The story begins several years earlier, in 336 BC, when a young Macedonian king named Alexander inherited the throne from his assassinated father, Philip II. At only 20 years old, Alexander had already shown brilliance in both strategy and vision. He wasted no time consolidating power in Greece, crushing revolts and securing his position. But his eyes, even then, were fixed eastward. Beyond the Aegean lay the Persian Empire, the largest dominion the world had yet seen, stretching from Asia Minor to the Indus Valley. To many, Persia seemed invincible. But to Alexander, it was a challenge worthy of his ambition. He gathered an army of roughly 35,000 men, a force that, though small compared to the Persian host, was sharpened by years of Macedonian discipline. With this army, he marched east, intent on toppling the empire that had once tried to enslave Greece. And somewhere far to the east, in the lands of Bactria, sat Bessus, known by his full name Artaxerxes Bessus. At the time, he was in his 40s, a man seasoned by years of political maneuvering and military command. As satrap, he ruled over a province critical to Persia's defense, a land of rugged mountains, fertile valleys, and powerful tribes. Chroniclers later described him as tall, broad-shouldered, with the heavy beard of Persian nobility and eyes that betrayed both intelligence and ambition. When Darius III called upon his satraps to defend the empire, Bessus answered. He led Bactrian troops into the monumental clash at Gaugamela in 331 BC, where the Persian host confronted Alexander in one of the largest battles the ancient world had ever witnessed. The numbers had favored Persia, but the tactics belonged to Alexander. And in the end, the outcome was devastating. Darius fled the battlefield. His once mighty empire was suddenly fractured. It was in the aftermath of this defeat that the seeds of betrayal were planted. Darius abandoned his capitals, his treasuries, and much of his authority, retreating ever eastward. His flight through Persia was a visible sign of weakness, and weakness in the ancient world was an invitation to predators. Among those watching closely was Bessus. To the satrap, Darius was no longer a king to be followed but a liability dragging the empire toward ruin. He began to whisper with other dissatisfied nobles, men who saw little hope in loyalty to a monarch constantly in retreat. They were not merely disillusioned. They were ambitious. And in their ambition, they plotted an unthinkable act, the murder of their king. But that moment still lay ahead. For now, in 329 BC, Bessus was dragged through the streets, his pride gone, his body broken. The onlookers had no doubt heard of his role in the assassination, how he had declared himself the new ruler of Persia, how he had believed he could win Alexander's favor by presenting the head of Darius preserved in salt. The irony hung heavy in the air, the very act he thought would secure his survival had sealed his doom. Alexander had not been moved by opportunism. He had not been impressed by treachery. To him, Darius had been a worthy rival, a monarch deserving respect even in defeat. And to see that rival cut down by his own satrap was a violation that demanded the harshest possible retribution. As the prisoners stumbled forward, guarded by Macedonian soldiers, the memory of Alexander's oath rang in the minds of those present. He had vowed to pursue Bessus to the ends of the earth. He had poured resources, time, and men into this pursuit, pausing even his wider campaigns to hunt down a single fugitive. Now, at last, the chase was over. The crowd pressed tighter, their murmurs rising. Some pitied the condemned man. Others saw justice. For them, betrayal of a king was not just treason, it was sacrilege, an affront to the gods themselves. And if the punishment seemed cruel, they told themselves it was no more than the betrayal deserved. Ahead of Bessus, on the hill overlooking the Macedonian camp, preparations had already been made. A tall wooden stake stood upright, its tip sharpened to a merciless point. The executioners, men hardened by years of grim duty, waited for the signal. This was not an ordinary execution. It was theater, a demonstration meant to burn itself into memory. Alexander himself would speak before the punishment began. He would recount the crimes, the cowardice, the betrayal. He would remind the world that war could be fought with honor, that enemies could meet as soldiers, but that treachery was an abomination. And then, with all eyes upon the stage, the punishment would commence. The city watched as Bessus was dragged toward the place of execution. His gait was slow, uneven. His face, once proud and stern, now sagged under exhaustion. Yet in his eyes, some still claimed to see defiance, the flicker of a man who had once declared himself King of Kings. The crowd's whispers swelled as they followed the condemned man up the hill. Some carried children on their shoulders so they might remember this day. Others stayed silent, uncertain whether to recoil at the cruelty or to marvel at the power Alexander wielded. History would later record the execution in chilling detail. But for those who stood in the heat of that day, it was more than a story. It was a moment when ambition, betrayal, and vengeance converged. It was the fall of a man who had reached for a throne and instead found the stake. And it was only the beginning of a tale that would reveal not just the fate of Bessus, but the transformation of Alexander himself. Before the jeers of the crowd, before the blood and the stake, Bessus had lived in splendor. His world was not one of chains and humiliation but of palaces, servants, and authority that reached across the mountains and valleys of Central Asia. He was not merely a provincial governor, he was the satrap of Bactria, and that title meant far more than administration. It meant command, wealth, and a place among the highest nobles of the Persian Empire. Bactria was no ordinary province. Situated where the Iranian plateau gave way to rugged mountains and fertile river valleys, it was the empire's shield in the east. To the west lay Persia's heartlands, and to the east stretched the routes toward the Indus, where traders carried goods, ideas, and armies. Whoever controlled Bactria commanded not just a province, but a gateway. For generations, satraps of Bactria had been men of immense influence, and Bessus was no exception. His court mirrored the opulence of the Persian royal centers, carved wooden halls draped with embroidered textiles, feasts that stretched late into the night, and retainers who bowed at his presence. Chroniclers would later describe him as a tall, imposing figure, broad in the shoulders, with the full dark beard of Persian nobility, a beard carefully perfumed and styled, a mark of his station. His eyes, they said, were sharp, restless, always calculating. By the time Alexander rose in the west, Bessus was already seasoned in politics and war. In his 40s, he had weathered decades of imperial intrigues, shifting loyalties, and border conflicts. He had marched at the command of Darius III, the reigning King of Kings, and had led Bactrian troops in the fateful clash against the Macedonians at Gaugamela. To understand the weight of that role, one must see the Persian Empire for what it was, a vast dominion stretching from the Aegean to the Hindu Kush. No single monarch, however mighty, could govern such a realm alone. Instead, the Achaemenid kings ruled through satraps, governors who held near absolute authority in their provinces. They collected taxes, commanded local armies, enforced law, and maintained order. In exchange for this power, satraps owed loyalty to the great king. They were expected to defend the empire's frontiers, send tribute to the royal treasury, and appear at the king's summons. But with power came temptation. Some satraps grew ambitious, ruling like monarchs in their own right, and the further a satrap was from the king's court, the easier it was to imagine independence. Bactria, distant and difficult to reach, was especially prone to such ambitions. And Bessus, intelligent and proud, harbored them more than most. When word spread in 336 BC that Alexander of Macedon had ascended the throne, few in Persia took notice. He was a boy of 20, untested, the son of Philip, whose ambitions had ended with an assassin's blade. Surely this young king could not threaten the greatest empire on earth. But Alexander was not to be underestimated. Within months, he had secured Greece, suppressed rebellions, and crossed into Asia Minor. In 334 BC, his army of some 35,000 men defeated Persian forces at the Granicus River. 2 years later, he crushed another Persian host at Issus, sending Darius III fleeing eastward. And in 331 BC, at Gaugamela, the might of Persia faced the brilliance of Macedon head-on. It was there that Bessus, commanding Bactrian cavalry, rode into the storm. Ancient accounts describe fierce resistance from the Persian horsemen, but against Alexander's phalanx and the disciplined Macedonian cavalry, they were eventually broken. The battlefield was chaos, dust, shouting, the clang of weapons. In the midst of it, Darius fled, abandoning his throne and treasure. For Bessus, the sight of the king's flight was not merely demoralizing. It was damning. A king who fled was no king at all. In that moment, seeds of doubt sprouted into ambition. In the months that followed, as Darius retreated deeper into the east, Bessus began to consider what loyalty was worth. He was satrap of Bactria, ruler of one of the richest provinces. He commanded troops still loyal to him personally. And he could see the empire collapsing, fragmenting under pressure from a young foreign conqueror. The Persian system prized loyalty, but it also prized survival. And to Bessus, survival meant opportunity. Why should he cling to a faltering king when he could grasp the title himself? After all, he shared noble bloodlines, and in the east, he commanded respect. If Darius fell, someone would have to take his place. Why not Bessus? This was the dangerous thought that began to guide his actions. The Persian Empire had long been a patchwork of alliances, rivalries, and betrayals. Kings rose and fell, sometimes with daggers planted not by foreign foes but by their own nobles. To betray a king was risky, but not unthinkable. Yet what made Bessus's path fateful was the figure rising in the west. Alexander was not content with victory. He sought legitimacy, to be seen not just as a conqueror but as a rightful ruler. When Bessus later struck down Darius, believing he would earn Alexander's gratitude, he fatally misjudged the young Macedonian's mind. But in this early moment, before betrayal, before chains, Bessus stood as one of Persia's great men, a satrap with land, soldiers, and authority. In the banquet halls of Bactria, among the laughter of courtiers and the gleam of golden goblets, he could scarcely have imagined the end awaiting him. The road from satrap to fugitive would be paved by choices made in desperation. The Persian defeat at Gaugamela left the empire in shambles, and Darius's flight created a vacuum of authority. Into that vacuum, men like Bessus would step, driven by ambition cloaked as necessity. But history has a way of turning ambition into downfall. The same intelligence, the same restless eyes that once secured him power would soon betray him. He would mistake treachery for strategy, and in so doing, seal his fate. For now, though, in the years after Gaugamela, Bessus still lived in authority. His palace still echoed with voices of supplicants. His soldiers still saluted his name. His banners still flew in the mountain passes of Bactria. Yet as Alexander's army pressed eastward, as city after city fell, and as the great King Darius faltered, Bessus's path toward betrayal grew clearer. And with it, the shadow of his own destruction began to stretch across the horizon. The fate of empires often turns not on the strength of armies but on the weakness of kings. In the years following Gaugamela, the Persian Empire, once the most formidable dominion the world had ever seen, was unraveling. At the heart of this collapse stood King Darius III, a monarch whose authority had been shattered not only by defeat but by the endless spectacle of flight. After the rout at Gaugamela in 331 BC, Darius abandoned the battlefield, leaving behind not only soldiers but the symbols of kingship itself. The capitals of Babylon and Susa fell into Alexander's hands, their treasures seized, their people offered clemency by the conqueror. The empire's ceremonial heart, Persepolis, burned under Macedonian torches, its palaces reduced to ash in an act that some said was revenge for the Persian burning of Athens a century earlier. To the Persians, the flames were more than destruction, they were humiliation, proof that the great chain of kingship had been broken. For a satrap like Bessus, watching from the eastern provinces, the image of his king's weakness was impossible to ignore. News traveled fast along the royal roads. Darius had fled again, abandoning not only his armies but the treasures of his ancestors. In the ancient world, kings were supposed to embody divine favor. To run was to admit the gods themselves had turned their backs. Still, loyalty lingered in some quarters. Darius gathered what men he could, pulling satraps from the east to his side. Among them was Bessus, who rode with his Bactrian cavalry to support the king in his desperate retreat. But each mile seemed to erode Darius's authority further. His once grand retinue had shrunk to a shadow of its former self. Instead of leading as the King of Kings, he moved like a fugitive, constantly glancing over his shoulder toward the west, where Alexander advanced with relentless speed. The imagery was powerful, Alexander, youthful and unstoppable, marching ever forward, while Darius, aging and beleaguered, stumbled eastward with fewer and fewer allies. To those who still followed him, the contrast was undeniable. One seemed chosen by destiny, the other abandoned by it. By the winter of 331 into 330 BC, Darius's position had become desperate. He had fled as far as Media, and from there, further east toward Parthia and Hyrcania. Each province he entered offered fewer troops, fewer resources, and less loyalty. Among his companions, whispers began to spread. Could this man still claim to be king? Could he be trusted to rally Persia once more? Or was he simply dragging them all toward ruin? Bessus listened to those whispers. In the long nights of retreat, campfires burned low, and satraps exchanged quiet words beyond the reach of the king's ears. One of the most influential voices belonged to Nabarzanes, the chiliarch of the royal court, a man close enough to Darius to sense the full measure of his decline. Another was Barsaantes, satrap of Aria. Together with Bessus, they formed a triangle of discontent, bound not by loyalty but by ambition and fear. Their logic was cold and pragmatic. If Darius surrendered, Alexander would claim the empire unopposed. If Darius continued to flee, his flight would drag them all into oblivion. But if Darius were removed, if his life were ended, then perhaps they could reshape the narrative. They could present themselves to Alexander not as defeated enemies but as collaborators, men who had done him a favor by eliminating a rival. It was not a decision made lightly. In Persia, betrayal of the king was an unforgivable crime, one that stained entire families for generations. Yet history offered precedents. Kings had been replaced before by ambitious nobles, and the empire had endured. To Bessus, who already commanded the powerful eastern satrapy, the possibility of replacing Darius was not only thinkable, it was enticing. As the king's flight dragged on, the moment of decision approached. Somewhere along a dusty road near Hekatompelos, Darius rested in his carriage, exhausted from months of retreat. His captains urged him to surrender to Alexander, to end the humiliation and spare the empire further destruction. But Darius, proud even in defeat, refused. He would not yield to a Macedonian upstart, no matter the cost. That refusal sealed his fate. Bessus, seeing the opportunity, gave the order. The king who had once been hailed as the ruler of the known world was struck down by his own men. The accounts differ, some say he was stabbed outright, others that he was left wounded and abandoned. But all agree that Darius died in agony, cursing his betrayers with his final breaths. For Bessus, the act was more than rebellion. It was the beginning of a gamble. He declared himself the new King of Kings, taking the royal name Artaxerxes V, as though legitimacy could be conjured by a title. He demanded loyalty from the troops that remained, and for his first act as sovereign, he had Darius's head preserved in salt and dispatched to Alexander's camp as a token of submission. It was here, in this moment, that Bessus's ambition and his fatal miscalculation converged. He believed Alexander would welcome the gift, would see in Bessus a useful ally who had spared him the trouble of hunting down a rival. Instead, Alexander's reaction was one of fury. Far from gratitude, he saw in the salted head of Darius the very image of dishonor. To Alexander, Darius had been a king, a worthy opponent, and even in defeat he deserved dignity. To kill him in betrayal was to spit upon the sacred order of kingship itself. When Alexander ordered the execution of Bessus's envoys on the spot, the message was clear: this was no favor. This was an abomination. He buried Darius with full royal honors, laying him to rest as though he were still the sovereign of Persia. And in doing so, Alexander made his intentions known. This war would not end with Darius's death. It would end with vengeance upon the man who had betrayed him. From that day forward, Bessus was no longer just a satrap, no longer a noble of Persia. He was a marked man, hunted across mountains and deserts by the most relentless conqueror the ancient world had ever known. The shadow of betrayal clung to him, and the wrath of Alexander pursued him. For the Persians, the murder of Darius was a rupture in their world. The old order had collapsed not only under the weight of foreign conquest but under the treachery of its own sons. For Alexander, it was an insult that demanded the harshest retribution. For Bessus, it was the first step down a road that would lead inexorably to chains, torture, and the stake. The decline of Darius had opened the door. Bessus had walked through it. But what he found on the other side was not power, not security, but the gaze of a man who would chase him to the ends of the earth. The road east was long and cruel. Each mile carried the Persian royal party further from its heartlands and deeper into despair. The dust of Media and Parthia clung to every cloak, every banner, every soldier's face. Darius rode not at the head of an army, but in a carriage, his body worn from months of flight, his spirit battered by repeated defeat. The once proud ruler of Persia, who had inherited an empire spanning continents, was now little more than a fugitive under the protection of men whose loyalty was unraveling with every step. To his captains, he still tried to project dignity. He spoke of regrouping, of raising fresh levies in the east, of striking back against Alexander. But his words rang hollow. Each promise of resistance was undercut by the sight of deserted camps and dwindling supplies. Where once whole provinces had turned out to honor the King of Kings, now villages closed their gates, fearful of Macedonian retribution. Even the soldiers who marched at his side muttered doubts by the fire at night. Among those soldiers rode Bessus. He had sworn loyalty to Darius, fought under his banner, and shared his table. Yet each day of retreat hardened a thought already forming in his mind: this king was finished. The empire's survival, perhaps even his own, demanded action. At his side were two others who shared the same conclusion: Nabarzanes, the Chiliarch of the royal guard, and Barsantes, satrap of Aria. Together they whispered in low voices, their eyes always darting toward the carriage where Darius rested. The plan was simple, and yet it was treacherous beyond measure. They would remove the king, cut away the weakness at the empire's core, and present themselves to Alexander as men of pragmatism rather than loyalty. In doing so, they believed, they would save themselves and perhaps even gain favor with the Macedonian conqueror. The moment came on a lonely stretch of road near Hecatompylos in 330 BC. The day was dry, the horizon blurred with dust. Darius sat slumped in his carriage, his once ornate robes dulled by travel, his crown long since abandoned. His companions urged him once more, surrender, send word to Alexander, preserve what remained of Persia through negotiation. But Darius, even in defeat, clung to pride. He rejected the idea of yielding to a foreign invader. His refusal was not shouted, but firm, his voice ragged yet resolute. For Bessus and his allies, the refusal was the final straw. They moved swiftly. Soldiers loyal to them surrounded the carriage. A blade flashed in the sunlight. The king struggled, his weakened body no match for armed men. He was stabbed, and the air filled with the sharp cry of betrayal. Some accounts say he lingered, left to bleed slowly as the conspirators abandoned him to the desert. Others suggest they ended his life outright, unwilling to let him speak another word. What all agree upon is the cruelty of that moment, the last Achaemenid king dying not on the battlefield, not at the hands of a foreign foe, but in the dust, struck down by his own satraps. Darius's final breaths were said to be curses. He condemned those who betrayed him, calling down shame on their names for eternity. There was no grandeur in his death, no last stand among his men, only pain, exhaustion, and the bitterness of betrayal. His blood soaked into the desert soil, marking the end of a dynasty that had ruled Persia for 2 centuries. For Bessus, however, the death was not an end but a beginning. In the silence that followed, he raised his voice. He proclaimed himself the new King of Kings, adopting the regal title Artaxerxes V. To the troops who remained, he demanded loyalty, insisting that he would lead Persia in the face of Macedonian invasion. Some obeyed out of fear, others out of habit. But even among those who saluted, there was unease. They knew legitimacy did not come from a declaration shouted in the desert. It came from recognition, and in that regard Bessus's path was perilous. His first act as king was meant to secure that recognition. Darius's head was cut from his body, preserved in salt, and placed in an ornate container. Bessus ordered it sent westward, to Alexander's camp, as a gift, a grotesque offering meant to show submission and loyalty. He believed the Macedonian king would see reason, that he would accept the gesture as proof of allegiance. Perhaps Alexander would even confirm Bessus as satrap or king in the east, allowing him to rule under Macedonian supremacy. But ambition had clouded Bessus's judgment. He misunderstood the man he faced. To Alexander, Darius had been more than an enemy. He had been a rival worthy of respect, a monarch whose lineage and authority demanded honor. When Alexander opened the container and saw the severed head of the king he had chased across continents, fury consumed him. Far from gratitude, he felt only revulsion. To him, the act was cowardice, an insult to kingship itself. In front of his men, Alexander swore an oath. He would hunt down Bessus, no matter how far he fled, no matter how high the mountains or deep the deserts. He would bring the satrap to justice, not only for the crime of murder but for the violation of honor. At that moment, the conquest of Persia became something more than war. It became personal vengeance. Bessus had thought himself clever, but the trap was already closing. Instead of protection, his betrayal painted a target on his back. His name was cursed in the west and whispered in the east. Even those who pledged loyalty did so with hesitation, sensing the doom that followed him. The body of Darius did not vanish into the desert as Bessus might have hoped. When Alexander reached the place of the king's death, he ordered the body collected. The Macedonian conqueror, who had once pursued Darius with unrelenting ferocity, now treated him with reverence. He gave him a royal burial, ensuring his remains were interred with honor. In doing so, Alexander not only condemned Bessus by contrast but also claimed a kind of moral authority over Persia itself. By burying Darius as a king, Alexander positioned himself as his rightful successor. News of this act spread quickly. To Persians who still mourned their monarch, it was a startling sight, a foreign conqueror honoring their fallen king, while their own satraps had abandoned and butchered him. The gesture won Alexander respect, but it also hardened the hatred against Bessus. In the months that followed, the image of the satrap turned king grew darker. He was no longer seen as a savior of Persia but as the betrayer who had delivered its last monarch to a shameful end. The whispers of ambition that once seemed pragmatic now marked him as cursed. Soldiers who once followed him began to doubt, and allies began to drift away. The murder of Darius had set events in motion that could not be undone. For Bessus, the act was a gamble that he believed would save him. Instead, it ensured his destruction. In the deserts near Hecatompylos, with a dagger and a declaration, he had written the first lines of his own death sentence. The man who proclaimed himself king would soon be hunted like a criminal. And the vengeance of Alexander would not be swift, but merciless, drawn out with the precision of a conqueror who understood that some lessons must be written in blood. When the chest carrying Darius's severed head arrived in Alexander's camp, the Macedonian king's reaction was immediate and visceral. He did not see it as a gift or a favor. He saw dishonor. In front of his generals, he condemned the act as vile, the work of cowards who had dared to lift their hands against their own sovereign. The envoys who had carried the head were executed on the spot. Then Alexander made a vow. He swore that Bessus would be hunted down, no matter the cost, no matter the distance. It was no longer simply about conquest, no longer about absorbing another province into his growing empire. It was personal. To Alexander, the betrayal of Darius was an insult not only to Persia's traditions but to the very principles of kingship. Even a defeated rival deserved dignity. To murder him in retreat was an abomination that demanded vengeance. From that moment forward, Bessus's name became a curse in Macedonian ranks. His figure loomed not as a satrap or a king but as quarry. Alexander paused other campaigns, diverting resources and manpower to a single purpose, the capture of Bessus. The man who had once commanded armies was now the most wanted fugitive in the known world. In Bactria, Bessus still tried to project authority. He styled himself as Artaxerxes V, King of Kings, and rallied what troops he could. He called on the fierce tribes of the region, hoping their loyalty to him as satrap would extend to his claim as sovereign. The land itself seemed to offer him protection. Bactria's rugged mountains, winding rivers, and fortified towns had resisted invaders before. If anywhere could shield him, it was here. At first, it seemed he might succeed. Between 330 and 329 BC, Bessus waged a kind of guerrilla resistance against the Macedonian advance. His men struck quickly, ambushing isolated detachments, then vanishing into the terrain. They burned supplies, harassed scouts, and used the knowledge of their homeland to evade capture. To villagers and tribesmen, the struggle seemed familiar, a local warlord defying a foreign conqueror. Some supported him out of loyalty, others out of fear. But Alexander was not a man easily thwarted. He had marched across Asia Minor, shattered armies many times larger than his own, and pursued enemies across deserts and rivers. He understood that defeating Bessus required not just strength but persistence. He built networks of spies, spreading gold and promises among the local people. Information began to flow, sightings of the fugitive, whispers of his allies' wavering loyalties, reports of hidden camps. Where villages sheltered him, Macedonian punishment was swift. Entire communities were fined, their leaders executed, their crops destroyed. Word spread quickly, to harbor Bessus was to invite destruction. Slowly, the circle began to tighten. The fugitive himself felt the pressure. Nights grew restless, and the loyalty of his men frayed. Even those who had once proclaimed him king began to wonder whether his rule brought only ruin. Supplies dwindled. Promises of support from distant allies never materialized. And the shadow of Alexander loomed larger each day, a relentless force advancing through mountains and valleys. The strain of flight was written on Bessus's face. Chroniclers suggest his once proud bearing gave way to haggard desperation. He still tried to command authority, still spoke of resistance, but the conviction in his voice no longer matched the reality around him. Soldiers muttered behind his back. Some deserted outright. Others, sensing the tide turning, began to calculate their own survival. Among those was Spitamenes, one of Bessus's closest allies, a noble of Sogdiana with influence among the eastern tribes. For a time, he had stood by Bessus, sharing in his rebellion. But as the net closed, Spitamenes recognized that loyalty to a doomed king could end only in destruction. He began secret communications with Alexander's forces, testing whether betrayal could buy his own survival. The decisive moment came at a banquet. Accounts vary in detail, but the essence remains. Spitamenes, under the guise of friendship, drugged Bessus's wine. As the self-styled king grew weak and unsteady, his companion seized him, bound him in chains, and delivered him to the Macedonian pursuers in exchange for amnesty. Thus, the man who had once dared to call himself King of Kings was reduced to a captive, betrayed not by foreign enemies but by his own supposed allies. It was an irony that mirrored his own crime. Just as he had struck down Darius, so too was he struck down by one who had once pledged loyalty. When Bessus was brought before Alexander, the air was heavy with anticipation. The conqueror, now 27 years old, was no longer the youthful king who had crossed into Asia with dreams of glory. He was a hardened veteran of countless campaigns, a man who had seen blood spilled across continents. He regarded the prisoner in silence, his gaze fixed, cold, and unyielding. Bessus, even in chains, clung to pride. He insisted that his actions had been necessary, that killing Darius was not betrayal but a measure to save Persia from humiliation. Perhaps he hoped that reasoning would sway Alexander, that the conqueror might recognize a kind of twisted pragmatism in his crime. But Alexander was unmoved. He had already judged the satrap, not only for the murder itself but for the arrogance that followed. Declaring himself king, sending Darius's head as a token, these were not acts of necessity. They were acts of ambition and dishonor. The sentence was pronounced, death by live impalement. A punishment infamous for its cruelty, feared even in an age accustomed to brutality. To the Greeks it was barbaric, but to Alexander, that was precisely the point. It would not be a swift execution but a public demonstration, a living warning to anyone who contemplated betrayal. Bessus had once imagined himself shielded by mountains, supported by armies, and respected as a ruler. Now, he was a captive dragged toward one of the most horrifying deaths the ancient world could devise. His journey from satrap to king to fugitive had ended not in power but in chains. And before long, it would end on the stake. The capture of Bessus had been long awaited, and when he was finally brought in chains before Alexander, the silence in the Macedonian camp was charged with tension. The men knew what this prisoner represented. He was not just another defeated satrap. He was the betrayer of Darius III, the man who had cut short the life of Persia's last king, and the man whose arrogance had led him to declare himself ruler in Darius's place. To Alexander, this was no ordinary crime. It was sacrilege. The conqueror sat in judgment, his gaze steady as Bessus was forced to kneel. Around them stood generals who had followed Alexander from Greece, men hardened by years of campaigning, yet even they seemed to sense that this trial would be unlike others. There would be no plea for mercy, no bargain for survival. The verdict was already decided. Bessus attempted a defense. His voice, though hoarse, carried the same pride that had once convinced him he could rule an empire. He argued that Darius had doomed Persia through weakness, that his refusal to surrender to Alexander had left no choice but to act. He claimed that killing Darius was not betrayal but necessity, a way to spare Persia further humiliation at the hands of Macedon. The words fell flat. Alexander did not reply immediately. He listened, stone-faced, as the prisoner spoke, and when Bessus finished, there was a silence so deep that even the rustle of banners in the wind could be heard. Then Alexander pronounced the sentence, death by live impalement. The announcement rippled through the assembly. This was no ordinary execution. Impalement was a punishment feared across the ancient world, infamous for its cruelty and the length of suffering it inflicted. To the Greeks it was barbaric, but that was precisely the message Alexander wished to send. The satrap who had dared to betray his king would not be granted a swift death. His agony would be made visible to all, a living warning to anyone tempted by treachery. Preparations began at once. A long wooden stake, sharpened to a cruel point, was set upright on a hill overlooking the camp. The site was chosen deliberately. From the plain below, thousands could gather to witness, both soldiers and local people. Word spread quickly, drawing villagers, traders, and camp followers, all eager, or fearful, to see what would unfold. For Alexander, this was theater as much as justice. The lesson would be carved into memory. At dawn, Bessus was brought out. He was gone from imprisonment, his once imposing figure reduced to a shadow of itself. His fine robes had long since been stripped away, replaced by the coarse garments of a captive. His beard was unkempt, his eyes sunken, but within them flickered a stubborn pride, the last remnant of the man who had once called himself king. Alexander himself addressed the crowd. His voice carried over the assembly, clear and unyielding. He recounted the crimes of the prisoner, the betrayal of Darius, the cowardly murder on the roadside, the arrogance of seizing a crown that was not his. He reminded those gathered that even in war, there was honor, that enemies could meet in battle with respect, but betrayal from within violated both human loyalty and divine law. When the speech ended, the executioners stepped forward. They were men accustomed to grim duties, their faces expressionless as they prepared the condemned. Bessus was forced to the ground, bound tightly with ropes. Then, with brutal precision, they drove the sharpened stake into his body, carefully avoiding vital organs so that death would not come quickly. His limbs were tied to prevent escape, his weight pressed down until the stake pierced deeper. The first scream tore through the air, sharp and unrestrained. The crowd, thousands strong, fell into a hush. Some recoiled, covering their children's eyes. Others leaned forward, unable to look away. To witness such a death was horrifying, yet it was also unforgettable, which was precisely what Alexander intended. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, its heat pressing down on the hillside. Bessus shifted between cries of pain and stretches of wordless endurance, his body trembling against the ropes that bound him. Blood trickled down the stake, dark against the wood. His face, twisted in agony, still carried flashes of defiance, as though pride itself refused to surrender even when flesh had failed. Alexander did not look away. He stood among his men, his eyes fixed on the man who had once eluded him across mountains and deserts. To the conqueror, this was justice served, vengeance fulfilled, and an example set. By nightfall, Bessus still lived, though barely. His breathing was ragged, his skin pale with shock, yet his heart continued to beat. Guards were posted to ensure that no one intervened, that the punishment would continue until its natural end. The stake had been placed with skill, missing organs that would bring a swift release, prolonging the torment across days. At dawn of the second day, he was still alive, though slipping in and out of consciousness. His body trembled with fever, infection already beginning its cruel work. The crowd, though diminished, still gathered, drawn by the grim fascination of witnessing the downfall of a man who had once commanded armies. Children whispered the name of the satrap who had betrayed his king, their parents pointing toward the stake as a warning. By the end of the second day, Bessus's body could endure no more. Blood loss, shock, and exhaustion brought the end. His head slumped forward, his breathing slowed, and at last, it stopped. The executioners stepped back, their work complete. But Alexander's vengeance did not end with death. The body was left on the stake, exposed to sun, wind, and carrion birds. For a week it stood there, visible from miles away, a grim silhouette against the horizon. Travelers passing through the region could not help but see it, a warning carved in flesh that treachery would not be tolerated. The message was unmistakable. The man who had once been satrap of Bactria, who had dreamed of kingship, who had dared to gamble with betrayal, now hung lifeless on a stake, his body a spectacle of shame. Alexander had not only avenged Darius but also claimed a kind of moral authority, presenting himself as the protector of kingship and the avenger of dishonor. Yet the scene revealed something else as well. Even loyal chroniclers would later note a shift in Alexander's character after this execution. The calculated cruelty, the decision to watch every moment, and the public display of the corpse suggested that vengeance had changed him. He had always been ambitious, always relentless, but now suspicion gnawed at him more deeply. Loyalty seemed fragile, easily broken, and he began to rule as much through fear as through inspiration. The stake on which Bessus died was not merely the end of one man. It was a turning point, a reminder that power was never secure, that betrayal lurked even among the closest allies. For the Persians who saw it, the execution was both terrifying and clarifying. The old order had collapsed, and the new ruler would tolerate no treachery. For the Macedonians, it was framed as justice, a sign that Alexander's reach was long and his memory unforgiving. When the body of Bessus was finally taken down from the stake after a week under the pitiless sun, the man himself was gone, but the story had only just begun to take root. His execution was not the quiet removal of a traitor, it was a spectacle seared into the memories of thousands. The villagers who had gathered, the soldiers who had stood in solemn silence, the merchants who passed along the road, they carried the tale outward, repeating it in marketplaces, camps, and caravan stops. What they had seen was not merely the punishment of a man. It was a lesson, one that would echo for generations. Betrayal was not just a crime, it was an unforgivable rupture of trust that demanded the most merciless response. For the Persians, the death of Bessus was doubly painful. On the one hand, he had betrayed Darius, the last of their kings, striking down the man who embodied their empire's ancient legitimacy. On the other, his punishment at Alexander's command underscored that the age of Persian supremacy had ended. No satrap, no noble, no general could restore what had been lost. Their old order was shattered, and their betrayer's broken body left as proof. For the Macedonians, the event was framed differently. Alexander had avenged Darius in the most public and dramatic way possible. He had shown that kingship, even in an enemy, demanded respect, and that dishonor could not be tolerated. It reinforced the image of Alexander not just as a conqueror but as a ruler who understood the sacredness of power. The message to his men was clear, loyalty was absolute, and betrayal would be punished beyond measure. Yet for Alexander himself, the episode marked a turning point. Even the most loyal chroniclers noted a shift in his demeanor afterward. Where once he had inspired through vision and charisma, he increasingly turned to fear as a tool of governance. Suspicion grew sharper in his mind. If a satrap could betray his king, then what of his own generals, the men who had marched with him since Greece? If Persia's nobles could kill Darius, what might stop Macedonians from doing the same to him? The shadow of Bessus lingered. In the campaigns that followed, against the Scythians, the Sogdians, and later in India, Alexander's hand grew heavier. Governors who hesitated were executed. Officers who showed signs of doubt were removed, sometimes violently. Even companions who had once shared his victories began to feel the weight of his suspicion. The laughter and camaraderie of earlier years gave way to an edge of tension, the sense that loyalty was no longer assumed but demanded, enforced by the memory of a man writhing on a stake. Ironically, Bessus's death did not prevent betrayal within Alexander's empire. In the years ahead, plots emerged among satraps, generals, and courtiers. Some were crushed quickly, others simmered until after Alexander's own death. The conqueror had learned what rulers across centuries had discovered: fear could secure obedience in the short term, but it was never a permanent safeguard. Still, the cautionary tale of Bessus endured. In the oral traditions of Central Asia, travelers spoke of the satrap who reached too high, who imagined he could outwit both his king and his conqueror, only to die in agony. To Persians, he became a symbol of ambition without foresight, the man whose betrayal destroyed the last vestiges of their empire. To Macedonians, he was remembered as the ultimate example of dishonor punished. And to later historians, he was a warning etched in history itself. The contrast between Bessus and Alexander was stark. One man had seized opportunity through treachery, believing he could manipulate events to his favor. The other had seized opportunity through vision, ambition, and relentless pursuit. One died despised, his name cursed. The other lived to become legend, though his legacy too would be shadowed by ruthlessness. In the end, the story of Bessus was not simply about politics or conquest. It was about the fragile line between power and ruin. It was about the gamble of betrayal, and the terrible cost when that gamble failed. The satrap who had once sat in opulence, who had commanded armies and demanded obedience, ended not as a king, not even as a prisoner granted mercy, but as a spectacle of agony, left exposed to the winds and carrion birds as a warning to all. The tale also illuminated the paradox of Alexander. His decision to honor Darius with a royal burial revealed a respect for kingship that transcended enmity. Yet his choice to execute Bessus with such cruelty revealed a darkness that would grow within him. The conqueror who dreamed of uniting the world under his banner also carried the seed of suspicion that would consume him. In avenging betrayal, he had also hardened himself against the very loyalty he sought to inspire. Centuries later, when chroniclers retold the story, they did so with a sense of inevitability. They framed it as the clash of destiny, the ambitious satrap who believed he could grasp a crown and the unstoppable conqueror who would not forgive dishonor. But for those who lived through it, there was nothing inevitable about the fear, the screams, or the silence that followed. It was the brutal reality of power played out on a hilltop, where ambition met its end in blood and wood. Even after Alexander's empire fractured following his death, the memory of Bessus survived. Soldiers told it as a warning to their comrades. Merchants carried it along the Silk Road as a tale of hubris. In the lands once ruled by Persia, it became a story mothers told their children, the tale of the man who betrayed his king and paid with a death worse than death itself. 2 millennia later, historians still record his name, not as a hero, not as a ruler, but as a warning. He is remembered not for his victories, not for his governance, but for his betrayal and his end. Bessus remains the embodiment of the truth that in the ancient world, power without honor was a curse, and betrayal was a debt repaid in the most merciless coin. The stake on the hill may have long since rotted away, the bones of Bessus lost to the soil, but the lesson has endured. In the desert winds of Bactria, in the chronicles of antiquity, in the whispered stories of travelers, the satrap who reached for the throne and found the stake lives on as one of history's darkest testaments.